For most of our species' long memory, we were little more than moving weather here and gone, a hush on the plains. People drifted in small kin groups, their paths crossing like faint scratches on stone, leaving behind a scatter of bones, a few flints, a hearth's grey sigh. Lives began and ended under open sky. Stories passed by breath, and then extinguished with it, surrendered to the same silence that takes the last curl of smoke. And yet, in one stubborn, sun-hammered corner of the earth, the silence was forced to keep a record. There, on a flat horizon where the wind has little to sing about but dust and heat, the ground itself remembers. The locals call the mounds tell, not hills of mere dirt, but layered vessels of human time. Each tell is a stack of cities, a layer cake of mud brick walls fallen and rebuilt, of courts and hearths, of shrines raised and leveled, of floors packed hard by 1,000 footfalls, then sealed by collapse and built over again. If you could cut one clean, it would show rings like a tree bands of ash where something burned, lenses of clay where someone repaired a roof, the thin red lines of a festive hearth that went cold in a single winter. One world laid down to sleep, another world making its bed upon the old one's chest. At first glance, a tell looks like a natural swell of land, the way a scar looks like skin. But no, this is architecture that learned to breathe in centuries, not in seasons. The mud that composes it is not idle. It is the river's gift, kneaded by human hands, dried in a pitiless sun, mortared with a faith that tomorrow will come and need shelter. A tell is a buried city, and a buried city is a promise made to the future. Even in ruin, it keeps the promise by preserving the patterns of a life that dared to be permanent. If you dig into such a mound and the spade is reverent whether it knows it or not, you pass through lost worlds. One layer holds the ash of some long-ago hearth where barley simmered and strangers argued softly through the night. Another layer holds a threshold stone polished by the same toes climbing in and out for 30 years. There are floors patched and patched again, child burial jars set beneath doorways to watch the comings and goings of the living, and in the courtyards, the outlines of ovens like moons gone to sleep. Deeper, the rooms constrict, and the walls grow more cautious. And then one day you arrive at the bottom, where the first attempt at staying put is still there like a held breath. Below the names we know, below Akkadians and Babylonians, below empires that turned dust into law something earlier, flickers, bright and baffling. It lasted, as these things go, only a few centuries of creative thunder. In that span, a people invented the habit of cities, the authority of kingship, the grammar of law, the habit of writing, and a new way to measure the sun's patient tyranny. Their neighbors would later call them the black-headed ones. We have learned to call them Sumerians. They rise out of the lowest strata like a rumor that decided not to die. But their story is braided with a rule more ancient than any city. Water decides. To speak of this beginning is to speak of the double river, the Tigris swift and cutting, the Euphrates broad and moody, too long, brown arteries carrying snowmelt and mountain silt from far ranges where cloud shadows graze the rock. Here, between them, the land is a flat table laid in a harsh light. The blessing is also the danger. When the rivers rise, they do not do so with the gentle courtesy of the Nile, which pulses like a god's slow heartbeat in answer to the calendar number. These rivers are untamed, late, sudden, inconvenient. They kneel on the fields when the barley is young and soft, crushing it with an impatient knee. In an afternoon, a village's work can become a swirling funerary offering. Imagine the sound. A wall of water wearing a coat of sticks and animals and broken roofs, speaking with the same voice as a storm god. Imagine the sight. The boundary between land and river dissolved into a churn of brown muscle. Even those who believe in omens need no priest to interpret that sign. And yet when the anger withdraws, it leaves behind the very thing a farmer would beg the gods to send. A skin of new earth, heavy and dark and rich with minerals. Grief has washed down from lion-colored hills. With flood, terror, with retreat, abundance. To live here is to accept that the hand that slaps is also the hand that feeds. In such a place, waste and wonder share a roof. There is no long timber to beam a great hall, no good stone to quarry, no friendly outcropping of copper to pound into an honest blade. You have mud, sun, water, reed, and from these paupers' tools, people pulled a cathedral's future. They mixed clay with straw and sand, pressed it into molds with the confidence of a baker, and laid the loaves in the killing light to harden. With these countless small simplicities, they built a city that could take heat like a kiln, and then they built those cities higher and higher, platform on platform, to lift their holy places out of the river's temper. If mountains refused to come to the plain, then mountains would be made. The first ziggurats were not only chapels of worship, they were statements in clay against the tyranny of water. Every layer of a tell carries this stubbornness. In the mortar there is ritual, small cones stamped with marks, an amulet tucked under a threshold, a bowl inverted over something precious. Night by night, those who lived at the river's mercy hedged their odds with offerings. A splash of beer at the doorstep, a whisper to the house, God at the hearth, a reed charm tied to a lintel to confuse the attention of whatever prowls between flood and fever. The city, as it grew, became a machine of faith as much as a machine of grain. Its alleys braided like channels, its courtyards collected light like cisterns. Its temple courtyards were stages where human order could reply to divine weather. But a city is not only architecture, it is a decision repeated every dawn. We will stay. We will sow where the river has scoured. We will repair when walls slump. We will bury our dead under the threshold and step across their patience for as long as the roof keeps off the noon. This decision to remain creates memory with a weight you can measure. The tell is an archive not because anyone meant it to be, but because collapse is a kind of preservation. A broken room falls inward and seals its own biography. The next generation, pressed by need, roofs the ruin and calls it home. In this way, the mound rises, and time learns, reluctantly, to keep its drafts. If you listen between the sentences of earth, you can hear the first grammar of city life composing itself. The scrape of hose, the muttered tabulation of grain, the call and answer across scaffolds. Somewhere a foreman chants numbers like a litany. Somewhere a priest inspects the flight of sparrows over the river mouth. Somewhere a child traces his name with a reed in dust and watches his shadow write it again on the wall. The tell swallows these smallnesses and turns them into thickness, and thickness is the one thing a flood cannot easily carry away. What began as tents of reed beside shifting banks took on the courage of walls, then courtyards, then terraces for gods to descend upon. What began as a camp became an argument with impermanence, and the argument won often enough to breed confidence. If you want to see civilization not as an abstract achievement but as a habit of hands, come to the mounds where the wind smells of salt, earth, and crushed grass, where pottery sherds freckle the surface like stars that fell and never melted. At the deepest, earliest floors, you meet the ones who first turned the river's insult into provision. Their names do not survive, but their decision does. In that decision is the seed of what will soon be named Sumer, a people and a pattern. They did not defeat the rivers, they negotiated with them. They did not find mountains, they stacked their own. They did not inherit memory, they manufactured it, tablet by tablet, wall by wall, layer by layer, until even the ground could be read. And so the story enters its first clear room. The Sumerians, the black-headed people, stand in the doorway of recorded time. Behind them, the hush of 100,000 unremembered years. Before them, the long corridor of brick and law and measured days. The earth under their feet is both enemy and ally. The sky above them is both threat and scripture. Between the two, they lift a city like a lamp. This is where the whispering stops and the record begins. The tells rise like low islands in the sea of heat, and from their buried rooms, a future climbs the stairs. The story of the Sumerians cannot be separated from the breath of water. Theirs was a land carved not by mountains or forests, but by two serpents of mud and thunder, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers descended from far-off ranges, dragging snowmelt and silt, swelling with moods that ignored the prayers of farmers. where the Egyptians knew a Nile that rose with predictability, like a great cosmic pulse tied to the heavens. The Mesopotamians were given wild rivers, unruly, untamed, and merciless. The Nile was a divine clock, steady, gentle, a measured heartbeat that lifted life precisely when the fields longed for seed. But here in Mesopotamia, the rivers answered no clock, no season, no oracle. Their floods came not when crops had matured and could survive, but in spring when young barley and wheat lay soft and green, vulnerable as newborn lambs. Imagine it, weeks of careful planting undone in an afternoon, as a wall of brown water roared across the flat plain, seizing animals, homes, and children alike. It was not water that crept, it was water that struck, a torrent that rattled doors, tore through reed walls, and left only silence where laughter had been. Whole villages could vanish overnight, their memory sealed beneath the sediment. And yet, when the waters withdrew, they left behind something almost holy, a blanket of fertile earth, a layer of rich silt, heavy with minerals from mountains never seen, a paradox terror, married to blessing. To live between these rivers was to be balanced on a knife edge, condemned and rewarded in the same season. The land gave what no desert could dream, black earth that sprouted grain in furious abundance. But the price was eternal anxiety. Each spring, eyes turned toward the horizon where the water shone, wondering, will this be life, or will this be ruin? No wonder the Sumerians saw their gods as cruel and volatile. To them, divine forces were not smiling patrons but storm lords with shifting tempers. The floods seemed like messages written in violence, reminders that mortals lived under mercurial powers. The gods, they thought, could be bribed, placated, persuaded, but never trusted. Thus was born a worldview steeped in pessimism, a sense that chaos always lurked just beneath the surface of order. Folklore tells us of charms woven from reeds, knotted into riverbanks to hold back the fury, and of priests who read omens in the froth. At spring's threshold, offerings were cast into the currents, loaves of bread, bowls of beer, even carved figurines meant to appease the unseen beings who rode the floods. Each flood was imagined as a procession of spirits, water, demons, ancestors unsettled, even gods in disguise testing the courage of mortals. Yet hidden in this calamity was the secret of Sumer's triumph. Those layers of silt, spread like a funeral shroud across the plain, carried fertility unmatched anywhere else on earth. Crops grew tall, fields blazed gold, and a surplus was born that could feed more than the farmers who bent their backs to raise it. In that surplus, civilization found its first breath. But to survive here meant more than gratitude. It demanded cunning. How could frail mortals harness such chaos, bending flood and drought into predictable rhythm? How could they impose human order upon divine wildness? This question, this wager with the river, was the riddle the Sumerians answered, and in their answer lay the very foundations of civilization. Even in myth, the struggle remained vivid. To the east, in Akkadian hymns, the storm god Adad lashed rivers like whips. In Sumer, Enki, lord of the deep, whispered to mortals the secrets of canals and levees. In ritual drama, priests reenacted battles between chaos flood and city wall, reminding all that survival was not given, but wrestled from the gods themselves. Thus the twin rivers were never mere waters. They were blades, double-edged, life in one hand, annihilation in the other. To farm them was to gamble. To tame them was to risk blasphemy. To ignore them was to starve. And in that gamble, the first cities, the first laws, the first empires of Mesopotamia took root, born not of abundance alone, but of the terror of drowning. The rivers gave abundance, but they also withheld the tools most civilizations take for granted. The plains of Mesopotamia were fertile, yes, but poor in nearly every other resource needed for a great society. No mountains of marble rose nearby, no forests stretched to the horizon, offering timber for pillars and beams. No veins of metal shimmered in the dust, waiting to be struck by a miner's pick. To the Sumerians, the world seemed stripped bare, as if the gods had offered them bread, but denied them everything else. Yet in this deprivation lay a strange opportunity. For what they did have, they had in endless measure: clay, water, reed, and Sunday. The very things a flood left behind in ruin became the bones of their invention. From this poverty they conjured, not despair, but an empire of mud brick. They discovered that if you mixed clay with chopped straw or reed, pressed it into a mold, and left it to bake in the killing light of Mesopotamian summers, you could shape permanence. One by one, thousands of small bricks emerged, identical and humble, but when joined, they could withstand storms, heat, and time. With them, walls rose that cooled the interiors of homes in summer and held warmth through winter. Villages became towns, towns became cities, and cities grew teeth in the form of defensive walls. There was ritual even in this mundane craft. In temple construction, the first brick laid was often stamped with prayers or marked with the seal of the city's god. Sometimes offerings, tiny figurines, beads, or bowls of oil were buried beneath foundations, as if to anchor the building's spirit against collapse. Every wall was not just a barrier of mud, it was a plea to the unseen to let it stand. The Sumerians' poverty of natural resources forced them into genius. If mountains could not be quarried, then mountains would be made. And so rose the ziggurats, artificial peaks of mud brick, climbing tier upon tier into the sky. They were not smooth pyramids of stone like Egypt would later know, but terraced stairways for gods to descend. Their bulk was massive, but their meaning greater still, an attempt to lift the sacred above the reach of the flood, to plant heaven in clay. Imagine it, a plain so flat that even a mound could be seen for miles. Upon that horizon, a ziggurat rose like a giant's stair, its summit crowned with a small temple whitewashed to gleam in the sunday. Smoke curled upward from sacrificial fires, blending earth with sky. From below, people must have seen it as both a shield and a ladder, protection against chaos, and a bridge to the divine. Reeds too found their place in this alchemy of lack, woven into mats, lashed into huts, bound into boats. They were the fibers that stitched Sumerian life together. Even sound was harnessed. Flutes cut from reeds carried hymns through temple courts, thin and haunting, as if the marsh itself were singing. To sit by a canal at dusk and hear such a note was to be reminded that in this world of scarcity, music itself was a gift wrung from weeds. In myth, the clay was no less sacred. Sumerians believed the gods had molded humanity from wet earth, giving breath to dust. Every mud brick pressed into a wall echoed that first divine gesture, each new home a reenactment of creation. To build was not merely practical, it was sacred imitation. When a mason lifted a brick, he was repeating the work of the gods. Thus, the poorest land on earth became a forge of invention. Where another people might have perished, the Sumerians adapted. With mud, they built eternity. With reed, they built both walls and songs. With sun, they fired not only bricks, but a civilization. Their buildings may crumble faster than stone, but the ideas they kindled endured. The city, the temple, the ziggurat, the skeleton of urban life itself. And so, from scarcity, came an empire of abundance in thought and form. Mud brick and reed could raise walls, but they could not build a world entire. The Sumerians soon realized that their land, rich in grain yet barren of everything else, was both a gift and a trap. They had mastered the flood and conjured cities from clay, but for wood, for stone, for metal, the bones of a durable civilization, they had nothing. The solution was not beneath their feet, but far beyond the horizon. From necessity, they became traders. Barges loaded with barley and wool slipped down the Euphrates, their hulls low in the water from the weight of surplus harvest. In return, they brought back cedar logs floated from the misty forests of Lebanon, copper hauled from the deserts of Oman, and lapis lazuli, a blue so deep it seemed stolen from the night sky carried across mountains from distant Afghanistan. Each trade was not simply barter, it was communion, a web of lifelines spun outward from the heart of Sumer. These exchanges were never purely practical. Every caravan was a ritual of risk. Before setting sail, Merchants poured libations at river shrines, whispering to Ea, god of fresh waters, to still the currents and guard the grain. Amulets of fired clay, etched with protective lions, or the star of Inanna, were tucked into cargo to ward off theft and misfortune. The road to wealth was also the road to chaos, where storm, bandit, or desert spirit might devour profit in a single night. To the Sumerian imagination, the imported goods were more than materials. Cedar was sacred, a tree so tall it touched the dwelling of the gods. Myth spoke of its forests, guarded by monstrous beings Humbaba, whose breath was death, whose face was a mask of entrails. Every plank carried back from Lebanon felt like stolen lightning, a fragment of heaven seized by human hands. Copper, too, bore an aura beyond its shine. To shape copper was to harness fire's will, to summon resilience from ore, like bone pulled from the earth. A weapon of copper was not merely stronger, it was consecrated, its edge a prayer cut into the air. And lapis lazuli, deep and unyielding, was the stone of divinity itself. Its color mirrored the dome of the heavens. To wear it was to carry a piece of the firmament against one's breast. In epic hymns, even the gods decorated their temples with lapis, as if to remind mortals that some beauty was not of earth but of eternity. Thus trade was more than survival. It was myth enacted upon the rivers. Barges became pilgrim processions. Desert caravans became trials across realms where jinn and lions prowled. The act of exchange itself, grain for timber, wool for copper, was a ritual offering, a way of binding distant peoples into the orbit of Sumer's abundance. By reaching outward, the Sumerians became more than farmers or bricklayers. They became merchants, ambassadors, interpreters of far-off tongues. Their markets rang with voices from mountain and coast. Their temples glittered with goods touched by other skies. The rivers had forced them to learn the logic of canals. Scarcity forced them to learn the logic of horizons. And in doing so, they became the first to weave the world into a net of trade. What began as survival soon became identity. The Sumerians were not isolated. They were nodes in a grand, dangerous circuit of exchange, bringing together the cedar of high mountains, the stone of long deserts, and the jewels of unreachable lands. Out of mud and distance, they wove a civilization, its threads stretching far beyond sight. Long before Uruk's walls and Gilgamesh's boasts, another people bent their backs to the marshes and made the first experiments in permanence. Archaeologists call them the Ubaid, after a low mound where shards of their pottery were found, thin-walled bowls etched with quiet geometry, designs of spirals and crosses that seem less like decoration and more like prayers fixed in clay. From about 6,500 BC, these Ubaid folk were already taming the swamps and coaxing the rivers into obedience. They drained marshes, cut channels, and proved that year-round settlement could be more than a dream. Theirs was no wandering camp. They built houses of packed mud, modest but enduring, and organized villages whose center was not the hearth but the temple. At the heart of each settlement rose a platform, lifted above the menace of flood, and upon it a shrine of sun-dried brick. These were not yet the towering ziggurats of later centuries, but their meaning was the same: to set apart a piece of earth as an axis between human labor and divine will. The raised temple was both shield and beacon, shield against rising waters, beacon to summon the presence of gods. Around these early sanctuaries, rituals bound the people together. The community labored not only for survival but for piety. Canals were dredged in the name of deities, fields planted under their watch, and offerings brought into the cool shadow of the temple doorway. Priests became not merely intercessors but organizers of labor, their chants timed with the swing of hoes. The work of keeping water in its channels and fields in their order was no less a sacred duty than a prayer. Even the tools bore traces of invention wrapped in myth. The clay sickle, a crescent baked hard, was both instrument and symbol. Its curve echoed the new moon, the blade by which gods themselves might harvest life. To cut barley with such a tool was to reenact a cosmic rhythm, a cycle of death and return that the Ubaid quietly understood. Folklore whispers that before planting, women poured milk into furrows as a charm of fertility, and that the first sheaf of grain was not eaten but left at the temple door. so the fields would not grow jealous. These fragments may be invention or truth, but they reveal something essential. Agriculture was not just technique, it was negotiation with forces too vast to trust. The Ubaid people, in their modest pottery and careful shrines, laid the grammar of a society that could last. They showed that cooperation, ritual, and irrigation could knit hundreds of lives into a single fabric. Without their groundwork, Uruk's splendor could never have taken root. Their temples were the first sketches of the ziggurats to come, their villages the rehearsal for cities that would one day dominate the earth. And though their name survives only because archaeologists gave it, their spirit lingers in every brick laid afterward. They were the first to prove that chaos could be endured, that water could be mastered, and that the gods could be courted not only with fear but with structure. In their quiet, persistent labor, the shape of Sumer was already forming, hidden like a seed waiting for flood. And Sunday, around 4000 BC, the rhythm of life in southern Mesopotamia shifted. What had been modest, Ubaid villages began to swell, spilling beyond their boundaries. Pottery once delicate and personal gave way to a rougher, mass-produced style, practical, efficient, suited not for a household but for a marketplace. A slow gathering of change built to a roar. The Uruk period, when towns expanded into the world's first cities. At the heart of this transformation was Uruk itself, a name that would echo into languages as Erek, Unug, and eventually give birth to the word Iraq. Uruk was not merely larger than its neighbors. It was something altogether new, a creature of mudbrick and firelight, breathing through canals, pulsing with the circulation of trade, ritual, and labor. Two sacred centers defined it. The first, the Inanna precinct, was devoted to Inanna, Queen of Heaven, goddess of love and war. Here, temples, courtyards, and workshops sprawled across acres. Without stone or fine wood, builders invented a new art, cone mosaics. Thousands of small painted clay cones, red, white, black, were pressed into wet plaster to form patterns that shimmered in the sunday. Walls became constellations of color, as if the goddess herself walked among stars brought to earth. To enter such a court was to step into a man-made cosmos. The second precinct crowned a vast platform, raised high above the plain in honor of Anu, Lord of the Heavens. Upon it stood the White Temple, its gypsum-coated walls gleaming like a beacon. Visible for miles, it declared Uruk's dominion over horizon and sky alike. This was not a building to hide gods in shadow. It was an altar in plain sight, an axis where divine and human worlds touched. The climb up its stairs was a ritual of ascent, each step narrowing the gulf between earthbound flesh and the inscrutable stars. Below these sanctuaries, the city tangled and spread. Houses of mudbrick clustered into neighborhoods, narrow alleys twisted like veins, canals branched like arteries, carrying goods and voices. The air must have been thick with clamor, the cries of merchants, the bleating of animals, the ring of copper hammers, the drone of priests chanting litanies to unseen powers. Smoke from hearths and kilns rose in slow columns, drifting across a plain where once only marsh grass had swayed. But Uruk was more than noise and walls. It was an organism, a being with organs and breath. Its temples were hearts, pumping ritual and meaning through its body. Its canals were veins, delivering lifeblood to fields and workshops. Its walls were a skin against chaos, a boundary marking where order began and wilderness ended. To live in Uruk was to become a cell in this living thing, part of a creature larger than any family, larger even than memory. The myths remember this moment with awe. It was said that Inanna herself chose Uruk as her seat, binding her fierce, paradoxical spirit to its destiny. And if the goddess of love and war called a city her own, then that city was destined to stride across the ages with both beauty and violence in its bones. Thus the Uruk period marked a threshold. Villages had been places for survival. Uruk was something else, a crucible where human ambition burned hotter than the sun-dried brick, a stage on which gods and mortals alike demanded monuments vast enough to be seen by eternity. The city had been born, and once born, it would never die. The Sumerians' greatest invention was not the wheel, nor the brick, nor even the written word. It was the harnessing of water. For in a land where rivers alternated between blessing and devastation, survival itself depended on bending chaos into order. And that could not be done by one family, or even one village. It demanded the labor of thousands, yoked to a single vision. They learned to build earthen levees, strong banks that shielded fields from the raging floods. They cut primary canals, great arteries carved for miles through the plain, and from these spread a lattice of smaller channels like veins, each delivering water where it was most needed. Reservoirs were dug to hold back the spring torrent, saving it for the long, punishing summer. And year after year, the system had to be dredged, repaired, renewed, else the rivers would reclaim all. This was not the work of solitary farmers, but of collective action. It was society itself learning to organize at scale. The temple stood at the center of this machinery, not only as a place of worship, but as command tower. Priests directed labor, measured flows, marked calendars, and distributed tasks. To dig a canal was to pray with a shovel. To dredge silt was to recite a hymn in sweat. Rituals sanctified this labor. Before the cutting of a new channel, a priest might sprinkle consecrated water at the dig site, calling on Enki, Lord of fresh waters, to guide the flow. At the opening of sluice gates, offerings of bread and beer were cast into the currents, appeasing the spirits believed to dwell within. The first floodwater diverted into the fields was sometimes greeted with song, as though it were a bride arriving at her wedding. Symbolically, the canals were seen as the arteries of the world body, delivering the pulse of life from divine rivers to mortal soil. Their upkeep was more than maintenance, it was ritual renewal, a reenactment of the cosmic order itself. To let a canal choke with silt was not just negligence, it was sacrilege, an invitation for chaos to slip back across the boundary. And yet the reward was immense. With canals and levees, the land was transformed into a grain engine, fields blazing with barley that ripened in dependable waves. For the first time in human history, a society could produce more food than its farmers could eat. The surplus was staggering, an energy that could be stored, distributed, and wielded. This surplus freed hands from the soil. Some became full-time artisans, weaving fine textiles and carving intricate figurines. Others became brewers, smiths, or soldiers. A new class of scribes emerged, trained to calculate rations and track harvests. Priests devoted themselves to interpreting the heavens and performing the ever more elaborate rituals of the temple. A hierarchy took shape, as if the canals of water had birthed canals of society. The cooperative irrigation system was not simply engineering, it was the birth of organized civilization, with the temple as its heart. From the gods flowed authority, from the temple flowed labor, from the canals flowed life, and in this interwoven cycle, chaos was, for a time, subdued. But the rivers never forgot their wildness, and the people never forgot their fear. Every spring, when the waters rose, they prayed the levees would hold. Every season, they returned to dredge and patch, their toil an endless reminder. Order is fragile, and only constant effort keeps it alive. A city, once born, must eat, and in Sumer, the mouth of the city was the temple. Grain, oil, wool, beer, everything flowed inward to the temple storehouses, colossal chambers of mud brick where the scent of barley mingled with dust and incense. The people worked not for themselves alone, but for the gods, whose priests measured, stored, and redistributed the harvest. To labor in the fields was to serve the divine estate. To receive rations was to share in the gods' bounty. Payment was not in coin. Money did not yet exist. Instead, each man, woman, and child was allocated daily or monthly portions. Jars of beer, baskets of grain, blocks of oil, bundles of wool. These rations were the currency of survival, a sacred wage. Behind every clay door seal broken and every jar tipped into a bowl lay the quiet assurance. The gods remember your labor, but memory in a city of thousands is fragile. How to track who had delivered grain, who had brewed beer, who had maintained canals. Here, the Sumerians revealed their genius. Administration became ritualized order. Priests and scribes filled clay tablets with marks of labor and allocation. Each entry was a prayer of precision, a hedge against forgetfulness. To secure this order, they devised the cylinder seal, a small stone, carved with lions, bulls, stars, or divine figures. It was worn on the wrist like a talisman. Rolled across wet clay, it left a unique pattern, an unforgeable signature. To press a seal into a tablet or storage door was to call witness. Here I stand, by the mark of my household and the gaze of the gods. These little seals became more than tools. They were personal spirits of identity, carried everywhere, kissed before transactions, passed down through generations like fragments of the soul. In the dim light of the temple storehouse, imagine the sight: rows of jars sealed with lumps of clay, each marked by a priest's stylus, and impressed with the whorls of a dozen seals. Each seal rolled once, twice, its animals striding endlessly across the clay, a procession of guardians locking the harvest in place. Every jar, every door, every account stone carried a miniature cosmos of images, as if to remind mortals that trust was not between men alone but between men and gods. The redistributive economy was itself a liturgy. Grain flowed in, grain flowed out, and every transaction was sanctified by ritual, sealed by image, counted by reed. The temple was not merely a storehouse or office, it was the brain and stomach of the city, feeding it, remembering for it, binding its parts together with contracts made visible. Thus bureaucracy was born not as a cold mechanism but as something sacred, half divine. The act of recording, of sealing, of redistributing, was a ceremony in itself. And in that ceremony, the fragile city gained a nervous system, the power to know, to remember, and to trust. Even the temple's careful order strained beneath the weight of its own success. A village elder could remember debts among a few families, but a city of 50,000 was beyond the capacity of any human mind. Grain owed, sheep promised, oil allotted. The flood of transactions threatened to drown memory itself. And so the Sumerians sought a new vessel, a memory outside the skull, something permanent and incorruptible. The first answer was simple tokens. For centuries, small clay markers stood for goods: a disc for a sheep, a cone for a measure of barley, a cylinder for a goat. A shepherd carrying 10 sheep might also carry 10 discs, a contract made tangible. The tokens were not mere counters, they were miniature embodiments, each a clay shadow of the thing it represented. But tokens could be lost or stolen, so the priests placed them inside hollow clay envelopes, called Bullae. Once filled, the ball was sealed shut and stamped with the party's cylinder seals. Now the promise was secure, its truth encased in fired clay. A bulla was both contract and prison, a small globe where obligations were locked like spirits. Yet there was a flaw. To check the contents, the ball had to be smashed, destroying the very record it was meant to preserve. It was then that some unknown scribe, weary of breaking and remaking, saw the answer. Before sealing the tokens inside, he pressed them against the clay surface, leaving impressions that revealed their number and kind. Soon, the tokens themselves were discarded. Why place them within when their ghosts already lived on the outside? Thus the bulla flattened into the clay tablet. This was the birth of writing. At first, the marks were pictographs, simple drawings scratched with a reed stylus into wet clay. A stalk of barley stood for barley, a human head for person, a jar for oil. Crude, yes, but powerful. An idea had been captured, frozen, and made visible to eyes that had never heard the original promise. Memory was no longer a fragile breath. It was clay, durable as earth. But clay resists curves. Dragging a reed through wet surface left ugly ridges. Scribes discovered it was faster, cleaner, more elegant to press the stylus instead of dragging it. The wedge was born. One wedge, 2 wedges, angled and combined, gave rise to a whole new script, Cuneiform. The wedge, shaped. In time, the signs lost resemblance to objects. A head rotated sideways, a barley stalk abstracted into lines. Pictures dissolved into symbols, and symbols became sound. Through the rebus principle, a sign for arrow might be used to represent the sound T, which also meant life. The leap was astounding. No longer bound to things, writing could now record names, prayers, laws, songs. It is said that Nisaba, goddess of writing, was the patroness of scribes. Her temples trained the keepers of memory, who worked by lamplight with reed styluses tucked like talons in their fists. Each mark was not just notation, but invocation. A tablet, once inscribed, became an object of power. To record was to bind. To inscribe was to conjure permanence. Thus, human thought stepped beyond the cage of mortality. Promises no longer died with the speaker. Laws no longer faded when the elders slept. Myths no longer relied on memory's frailty. From clay, from token, from wedge, the first true immortal voice emerged etched in earth, surviving flood and fire, waiting for millennia until another age could read it once again. Once the Sumerians had pressed their first wedges into clay, a new question emerged: how to calculate with them. The temple storehouses overflowed with rations and contracts, and administrators needed more than memory and tally marks. They required a system broad enough to measure fields, divide grain, schedule labor, and chart the stars. Their answer was not the familiar base 10 of our fingers, but something stranger, deeper, more flexible. Base 60, the Sexagesimal system. Why 60? Perhaps because 12 knuckles can be counted on one hand with the thumb, while the other hand keeps track of each set of 12. 5 times 12, 60. But in this humble gesture of counting on flesh, the Sumerians discovered a system of extraordinary elegance. 60 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, and 12. Fractions that would bedevil later mathematicians were, for them, clean and graceful. A loaf divided among 3 men, a field split into quarters, wages allocated over 12 months. All could be done without remainder, without frustration. Mathematics, for the Sumerians, was not abstraction. It was survival. It meant knowing how much barley to seed, how wide to cut a canal, how to portion rations for 10,000 laborers. Numbers were spells of order against the chaos of hunger and flood. But the system did more than measure grain. With 60 as their compass, the Sumerians turned their gaze upward. They sought to master time itself. The priests on their ziggurat terraces charted the moon's waxing and waning, noting when the crescent first bled into the night sky, when it grew fat, and when it vanished. From their patient records, they shaped one of the world's first calendars, 12 months, each tethered to the new moon. Yet a flaw soon revealed itself. 12 lunar months amounted to only 354 days, falling short of the solar year by 11. Each year, the seasons drifted farther from the calendar. Planting months arrived while fields still lay in winter's grip. Festivals of harvest came when barley was barely green. The solution was both practical and mystical. When the drift grew too large, the king, advised by his astronomer priests, declared an extra month. By decree, time itself was reset, the lunar and solar reconciled. This act was no mere bookkeeping, it was royal magic. The king, servant of the gods, could realign the heavens and restore cosmic order with a word. To insert a month was to retie the world's unraveling thread. In this weaving of time, numbers became ritual. To divide the year into measured spans was to make it a loom. Each day, a thread stretched across a divine frame. Festivals fell like jeweled knots upon it, sacred days shining against the ordinary cloth. Labor, too, was bound to this rhythm. Planting, harvesting, dredging canals, all kept to the gods' appointed calendar. Even now, we still live in the ghost of Sumer's numbers. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day, 360 degrees in a circle. These are not arbitrary, they are fossils of Mesopotamian thought, wedges of clay that still tick inside every clock and compass. The Sexagesimal system was more than mathematics. It was the enchantment of order, the conviction that chaos could be divided, measured, mastered. With it, the Sumerians laid invisible grids across earth and sky, binding time, space, and labor to the same relentless rhythm. As their canals ordered the earth, so too did the Sumerians seek to order the sky. For in the darkness above, they did not see lifeless stones circling in silence, but living powers, divine wanderers moving through a celestial pasture. To watch the heavens was to overhear the speech of the gods. From the tops of ziggurats, priests kept vigil. Oil lamps flickered at their feet, while their eyes scanned the vault where stars grazed like sheep under the watch of the moon. The moon itself was no mere light. It was Nana, the shepherd of the night. The sun was Utu, blazing judge of truth. Venus blazed as Inanna, queen of heaven, fierce and resplendent. Mars burned red as Nergal, god of plague and war. Mercury darted quick as Nabu, the divine scribe. Jupiter, vast and kingly, belonged to Marduk, while Saturn, slow and inexorable, embodied Ninurta, lord of the plough and war. These were not symbols, they were presences. Each planet was a god walking the sky, each movement an omen. A lunar eclipse foretold the death of kings. The rising of Mars could portend famine or invasion. Certain alignments whispered promises of prosperity or disaster. To read these signs was not idle curiosity, it was survival. Thus astronomy and astrology were born as twins. One measured, one interpreted. Both were sacred. Night after night, priests etched their observations into clay. Crescents, conjunctions, eclipses, risings and settings. Over decades, then centuries, their records became the first great dataset in human history. But for the Sumerians, it was not data. It was the divine diary, the writing of heaven itself. From this vigilance came the world's first map of the stars. They traced the sun's yearly path, the ecliptic, and marked along it great constellations, the lion, the bull, the scorpion. These celestial figures became the foundations of the Zodiac. At first local and fluid, later codified and standardized, they offered mortals a grid upon which to chart the gods' movements. Ritual wrapped every act of skywatching. Before an eclipse, priests fasted, purified themselves, and prepared substitute kings' figures who might symbolically absorb the omen's doom. When the danger passed, these substitutes were sacrificed or exiled, their fate a grim payment for the king's continued breath. The stars, then, were not only guides but executioners, their judgments deflected by human ritual ingenuity. Imagine the scene. Atop the white temple of Uruk, a circle of priests in the chill before dawn. Reed styluses ready, tablets prepared. The first light flares at the horizon. Venus shines in the east, and a murmur ripples among them. Inanna rises radiant, signaling war or passion or both. The record is pressed into clay, sealed with the priest's cylinder, stored in temple archives already heavy with centuries of night. In this way, the Sumerians did what no people before them had done. They bound the stars to clay. They turned fleeting lights into permanent records, fleeting omens into enduring systems. They gave us astronomy as calculation, and astrology as meaning two paths diverging yet always entwined. Even now, millennia later, we still read the ghosts of their sky. The 12 houses of the Zodiac, the circle of 360 degrees, the belief that destiny might be written in constellations, all are echoes of those first watchers on their mud-brick towers, listening for the gods in the silence between stars. The Sumerians understood power not as invention, but as inheritance from the divine. To them, kingship was not forged by men, nor won by conquest, but lowered from heaven. It descended like fire, like lightning, from the realm of the gods into the hands of mortals. Without this sacred mandate, no city could stand. Their texts proclaim it clearly. After the world was shaped and humans set loose in the floodplains, the gods looked upon the chaos of their quarrels and bestowed kingship as remedy. The king was not chosen by people, he was appointed by the divine council, a steward of cosmic order. His crown was not decoration but a sigil of heaven's will, his scepter, an earthly axis binding the city to the stars. This theology found its most haunting form in the Sumerian king list, a document that mingled myth and history with calculated purpose. It presents an unbroken chain of rulers from the dawn of time, each city holding the kingship until it passed to another. Even when one dynasty collapsed, the kingship itself never perished. It was eternal, transferred like a sacred object from one city to the next. The king list begins with a series of rulers before the flood immortal monarchs, whose reigns lasted not decades but millennia. One king of Eridu, Alulim, was said to have ruled for 28,800 years. His successor for 36,000. Such numbers were never meant as fact but as liturgy. They established that kingship was older than memory, older even than the deluge. It was a force beyond history, stretching back into mythic time. When read aloud, the list became a chant of legitimacy. By reciting the names of the ancient kings, a priest could tether the present ruler to the very first dawn of order. Each new monarch was not an upstart, but the latest custodian of a chain unbroken since creation. To resist him was to resist the cosmos itself. Coronation rituals embodied this theology. The king was led into the temple, purified with sacred water, clothed in garments heavy with symbols, the shepherd's staff, the net, the crown. He stood before the god's idol and swore to guard the divine estate, the canals, the fields, the storehouses. Only then was he enthroned, seated upon a dais that symbolized both mountain and ziggurat, the point where heaven stooped low enough for earth to touch it. To his people, the king was more than administrator. He was shepherd, judge, priest, and warrior. His success was measured not in conquest, but in the god's prosperity. Fields heavy with grain, canals flowing without breach, walls unbroken, temples humming with ritual. When famine or flood struck, it was not chance, but a sign that the king had failed in his duty to mediate between gods and mortals. In a world so precarious, kingship was both hope and burden. To see a crown was to see the shadow of heaven resting uneasily on human flesh. And always, behind the throne, loomed the reminder of its origin. Kingship did not rise from earth. It fell from the sky, blazing with divine weight, a gift and a chain all at once. In the earliest days of the cities, the ruler was known as the Ensi, the lord of the ploughland. He was a priest, king, half administrator, half intercessor, tending both to canals and to sacrifices. His charge was the welfare of the god's estate, not conquest. When the rivers were tamed and the fields yielded their bounty, the Ensi was praised as a good shepherd, leading his people to prosperity. But as the cities grew, pressing against one another's borders, prosperity bred rivalry. Water channels diverted upstream could spell drought for a neighbor downstream. Trade routes became lifelines, contested by rival settlements, hungry for cedar, copper, and lapis. And so the role of ruler changed. It was no longer enough to be a pious steward. A city needed a defender, a champion, a conqueror. Thus emerged the Lugal, literally, the big man. The title carried connotations not of the plough but of the sword. The Lugal was a warlord, a figure whose authority came not only from divine sanction, but from his ability to command armies and bend rival cities to his will. The Lugal eclipsed the Ensi, and with him came an age of warfare that would define Sumer's destiny. The transition was remembered in stories that blurred history and myth. One of the earliest heroic kings was Enmerkar of Uruk, said to have reigned for centuries. In epic tradition, he contended with the distant city of Aratta, nestled in the mountains of Iran, rich with gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. The tale speaks of messengers sent back and forth, of threats and boasts, of a contest between cities as much diplomatic as military. Aratta is depicted as a rival touched by magic, a land guarded by divine favor. Whether or not such a city truly stood, the story reflects a truth. Uruk's reach extended far, and its ambitions were imperial. These legends are more than propaganda. They capture the transformation of kingship itself. No longer was the ruler merely the caretaker of a god's household. He was a hero, a figure whose deeds reached into mythic time. His enemies were not only rival kings but monstrous guardians of distant resources, obstacles woven into the fabric of a hostile cosmos. Ritual kept pace with this shift. Battle standards were consecrated in temples, kissed with incense before being carried to war. Soldiers swore oaths by canal water, invoking the rivers themselves as witnesses to their loyalty. The chariot, drawn by onagers, became the warlord's thunder cart, echoing the storm gods whose violence was now mirrored on earth. The Lugal was no longer simply the city's steward, he was its embodiment in conflict. Victory proved divine favor, defeat suggested betrayal by the gods or failure of ritual. The battlefield itself became a kind of altar, where men's lives were offerings poured out to maintain the survival of their city. And so, in the space of a few generations, kingship hardened. The Ensi's gentle crook gave way to the Lugal's sharpened spear. Sumer had entered an age where memory itself became heroic, where rulers were remembered not only for canals dug and temples raised, but for battles fought and distant rivals humbled. It was an age of heroes, half men, half myths, whose names would echo through the corridors of time. Among the early Lugal, one name towers over all: Gilgamesh of Uruk. According to the Sumerian king list, he was the fifth ruler of Uruk's first dynasty, a figure straddling the line between history and myth. Archaeology whispers that a real king once built Uruk's massive walls, a feat of such scale that later ages could only imagine him as part divine. But literature would take his memory and transform him into something greater, the first epic hero. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells us he was 2/3 god and 1/3 man, a mighty ruler but also a tyrant who oppressed his own people. In answer, the gods created his equal Enkidu, the wild man of the steppe, running with beasts until civilization tamed him. Their first meeting was a clash of strength, a wrestling match in the streets of Uruk that shook the city walls. But from that struggle bloomed friendship, fierce and unbreakable. Together, they sought glory. They marched to the cedar forest, guarded by the terrifying giant Humbaba, whose face was a tangle of entrails and whose breath was death. To slay him was an act of hubris, yet they did it, felling the sacred trees to build temples and palaces. On their return, Inanna herself offered Gilgamesh her hand, but he scorned her. In vengeance, she sent the bull of heaven to ravage the land. Once more the friends prevailed, striking the beast down. But pride invites consequence. The gods decreed that one of the two must die, and it was Enkidu who fell, wasting away under divine sentence. His death shattered Gilgamesh. For the first time, the great king faced an enemy he could not overcome: death itself. Grief drove him from Uruk's gates, clad in animal skins, wandering across deserts and mountains in search of immortality. His journey led him to Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who alone had been granted eternal life. Through perilous seas and trials of darkness, Gilgamesh sought the secret of escape from mortality. Yet even when he learned of a plant that could restore youth, it was stolen by a serpent while he slept. Empty-handed, he returned to Uruk, but he was changed. The tyrant who had left was not the king who returned. He accepted that death could not be defeated. What endured was not flesh, but legacy. He pointed to the walls of Uruk, strong, enduring, built for the ages, and declared them his true immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh is more than myth. It is the first great meditation on mortality, the first story to ask what it means to be human in the shadow of death. It gave voice to a fear older than writing, and to a wisdom that still speaks. We cannot live forever, but through our deeds we leave echoes in time. By the mid-3rd millennium BC, Sumer had become a patchwork of proud, walled cities. Uruk, Lagash, Kish, each a jewel of culture, each bristling with ambition, each claiming the favor of its own patron god. The land was prosperous, its canals teeming, its temples filled with offerings, its storehouses fat with grain. Yet beneath the abundance smoldered tension. All drew life from the same rivers, all coveted the same strips of fertile soil. To divert a canal was to starve a rival. To seize a trade route was to wound another's lifeline. Conflict was not chance, it was inevitable. The Ensi had yielded to the Lugal. The shepherd king had given way to the warrior lord. Armies marched in tight formations, bronze-tipped spears flashing, heavy chariots rattling like thunder across the plain. The gods themselves were thought to choose sides, their idols carried into battle on litters, their favor invoked with sacrifices before the clash. The age of invention, the canal, the tablet, the ziggurat, was giving way to an age of war. The rivers that had birthed civilization would now witness its first great bloodletting. Who would rise? Who would fall? And which city would hold the kingship next? The stage was set, the bowstring drawn taut across the land of Sumer. The floodplains had given humanity civilization. Now they would teach it conquest.